The news spread across the galaxy like wildfire, a cruel display of power that the Imperial Senate of the Galactic Dominion assumed would go unnoticed. It was a quiet execution, meant to serve as a warning rather than a spectacle. 10 human women, chosen at random from various Imperial-controlled sectors, hanged at dawn on the central plaza of Gizmo Prime. The official report labeled them as enemy combatants, though no evidence had been provided, no trial conducted, no names even recorded. To the Empire, they were nothing, an afterthought, an act of bureaucratic efficiency. But the universe had made a mistake, a grave, irreversible mistake. No one could have predicted what followed. Within hours, the execution broadcast, meant as a subtle flex of Dominion authority, was intercepted and distributed through human communication networks. The message was clear. Humanity was under Imperial rule, and this was the cost of resistance. What the Empire had failed to grasp was the intricate web of human society, the seemingly innocuous connections that wove individuals together into an unpredictable, volatile force. They had executed a mother, the pillar of a grieving scientist, who had spent his life designing weapons that had never seen the light of day. They had taken the sister of a man who controlled the largest black market weapons trade in human history. One of the women had been an ex-wife to a military strategist with a vendetta so sharp it could cut through titanium. Another had been a beloved bartender at a military outpost, one who had poured drinks and listened to the stories of off-duty soldiers who now burned with fury. The Empire had unknowingly tied a noose around its own throat. Earth's response did not come as an official declaration. There was no pomp, no ceremony, no drawn-out deliberations in sterile conference halls. Humanity did not operate like the Empire, with layers of inefficiency and endless debate. It started in the shadows, a whisper among the most dangerous men and women on Earth. A deep space cargo freighter, the Midnight Wrath, disappeared from an Imperial checkpoint near the asteroid fields of Deneris 9. 2 days later, the communications relay on the border of Imperial space suffered an unexplained cyberattack, reducing the Empire's ability to monitor human activity. On the 3rd day, the first ship burned. A Dominion supply vessel, the Ruthless, had been on a routine patrol when an unknown energy signature was detected off its starboard bow. It had been a simple mission, one the crew had considered dull and uneventful, until a single distress signal blared across their comms. A human signal. By the time they responded, the Ruthless had already been breached. No alarms had sounded. No gunfire had erupted. Just silence, then darkness. The Empire's response was sluggish, dismissing the incident as a minor skirmish. But then came the next strike. And the next. Within a week, 8 ships had been seized, their crews either missing or found bound and gagged inside their own escape pods, humiliated but unharmed. It was psychological warfare at its finest, letting the Empire know that humanity could take them apart piece by piece without spilling a drop of unnecessary blood. The Galactic Dominion tried to downplay the attacks, labeling them as insignificant acts of piracy. But behind closed doors, the High Council grew uneasy. The problem with humans wasn't their technology, rudimentary by Dominion standards, or their numbers, which were laughable compared to the vast expanse of the Empire. The problem was their unpredictability. No one understood this better than Supreme Commander Ralph Vader, a towering figure of the Zalra species, his skin dark and glistening like polished obsidian. His 4 eyes scanned the reports laid out before him, mandibles clicking in irritation. Unlike his colleagues, he recognized the pattern in these attacks. The randomness was an illusion. The humans were testing the Empire, striking strategically, pushing limits without overextending themselves. This was not an uncoordinated rebellion. It was an act of war. "Bring me the names of those we executed," he ordered. The request was met with confused stares from his subordinates. "Sir, they were." "Find them." There was a pause, then hurried nods before the officers scurried away. Ralph Vader exhaled slowly, staring at the tactical map displayed before him. He was beginning to realize what many in the Empire refused to acknowledge. The humans weren't afraid of them. On Earth, the storm had already gathered. The War Council had been assembled in a repurposed underground bunker in what had once been a nuclear facility. The men and women gathered around the table were not politicians. They were not bound by oaths or guided by decorum. These were the warlords of humanity, military leaders, corporate magnates, rogue scientists, and criminal overlords, all united by a single cause. At the head of a table sat General Tom Miller, a man whose presence commanded attention even in a room full of predators. His face was lined with the marks of someone who had seen too many battles, his steel-gray eyes unwavering as he listened to the reports. The latest update was grim. The Empire had begun fortifying its borders, increasing patrols, and reinforcing their military presence in human-occupied space. They were preparing for an escalation. Good. Miller set down his tablet, taking a long breath before speaking. "We have one advantage," he said, voice steady. "They don't know how we fight." Across from him, an aging scientist adjusted his glasses. "They outnumber us 100-1, General." Miller smiled, the kind of smile that sent a chill down a man's spine. "They're an empire," he said. "We're a problem." The Galactic Dominion soon learned what it meant to make humanity a problem. The first planetary assault came without warning. A Dominion-controlled colony on the edge of known space, lightly defended, considered irrelevant in the grand scheme of Imperial strategy. The human strike team descended in the dead of night, disabling planetary defenses with shocking precision. Within hours, the colony was under human control. But they didn't kill the civilians. They didn't destroy infrastructure. Instead, they broadcast a message: surrender and you will be spared. Resist and we will take you apart one piece at a time. It wasn't brutality that made the humans terrifying. It was their efficiency. For the first time in its long history, the Galactic Dominion was afraid. The High Council convened in urgent assembly, debating endlessly over the situation. Some still dismissed the humans as primitive, arguing that the Empire had faced worse rebellions before. Others saw the truth. The humans weren't rebelling. They were retaliating. And they weren't doing it alone. The cracks in the Empire's foundations had already been forming long before the executions. Other species, long resentful of Dominion rule, watched humanity's defiance with interest. They had thought humans to be weak, easily controlled. But now they saw something different. They saw an opportunity. The first to break ranks were the Vahari mercenaries, warriors without a cause who suddenly found themselves admiring humanity's audacity. Then came the defection of an entire Dominion fleet, ships crewed by officers who had lost faith in the Empire's ability to rule. The Dominion was no longer facing a simple human problem. They were facing a revolution. And it had only just begun. Reports flooded in from various sectors, and each told the same story. Human forces striking where they should not have been able to, dismantling Imperial outposts with surgical precision. The losses were not catastrophic, not yet, but they were relentless. The humans were not fighting like any rebellion the Dominion had ever faced. They fought like an infestation, unpredictable and uncontrollable. For centuries, the Empire had ruled through sheer force, absorbing lesser species with the inevitability of a black hole. But humans were proving to be something else entirely, something neither predictable nor entirely logical. Ralph Vader could not comprehend their tactics, their erratic blend of savagery and restraint, nor could he understand their ability to turn any battlefield into their own advantage. The humans had no uniform fleet, no centralized command, no singular doctrine. And yet they were winning. His mandibles clicked in agitation as another transmission came through, this time from a high-ranking noble within the Dominion Senate. The figure materialized in a shimmering blue projection, Ambassador Valzeth, one of the Emperor's trusted envoys. His elongated face, lined with regal silver crests, twisted in irritation as he began to speak. "This is becoming unacceptable," Valzeth hissed, his voice layered with disdain. "You assured the Senate that these primitives would be crushed swiftly." "They do not fight like primitives," Ralph Vader countered, his voice even. "They should not be fighting at all." The ambassador's form flickered slightly. "Need I remind you, Commander, That our forces dwarf theirs? We have an armada that could glass their planet in a single day, should we choose. Then why have we not? Valzeth paused, his expression momentarily unreadable. Then he exhaled sharply. The Emperor does not wish to make martyrs of them. The executions were meant to be a message, not an incitement for war. Then we have underestimated the depth of their wrath, Ralvader admitted. They are not simply resisting. They are retaliating. The ambassador's form flickered again. Then you will stamp out that retaliation, Commander. This war is not one the Dominion can afford to prolong. End it. The transmission cut out, leaving Ralvader in the cold silence of his command deck. His officers shifted uneasily, waiting for their leader's response. He turned slowly, surveying the room, considering his next move carefully. He would set a trap. Deep in the void of the Sharvast expanse, a fleet of human ships moved with silent purpose. Unlike the gleaming monolithic dreadnoughts of the Dominion, these vessels were a ragtag collection of repurposed freighters, outdated military cruisers, and heavily modified civilian transports. The largest of them, the Indomitable, served as a temporary flagship. On board, General Tom Miller stood with arms folded, his sharp eyes scanning the holographic battle map before him. Across the table, Colonel Juno Reyes adjusted the fit of her armored vest, dark curls pulled into a tight bun, her expression unreadable. "They're setting a trap," she said, breaking the silence. Miller smirked. "Of course they are." Reyes narrowed her eyes. "Then why are we walking into it?" "Because we're better at it than they are." The corner of her mouth twitched, but she said nothing. It was a calculated risk, and they both knew it. The Dominion had finally decided to take humanity seriously, deploying a fleet large enough to crush any standard insurgency. If they were sending this many ships to a single sector, it meant they were confident in victory, which meant they had made their second mistake. Humanity did not fight wars with numbers. It fought wars with ingenuity, desperation, and an almost pathological refusal to surrender. A low beep sounded from the command terminal. The Dominion fleet had arrived. A lesser commander might have panicked. The Imperial forces outnumbered them 5-1, their warships gleaming with the arrogance of a species that had never known true desperation. But Miller simply adjusted his gloves and turned to his crew. "Give the order," he said. "Begin Phase 1. On the bridge of the Dominion flagship, Ralvader observed the human ships with cold scrutiny. Their ragtag fleet hovered in the distance, as though uncertain of their next move. He could sense the tension among his own officers. None of them wanted to admit that these irregular vessels had already inflicted significant damage on their forces in previous skirmishes. Still, this was where the humans' luck ran out. "Advance," he ordered. "Lock weapons." The Dominion fleet surged forward, warships cutting through the void with predatory grace. Energy shields flared to life, ion cannons charged, targeting computers locked onto the human vessels. Then, without warning, every Dominion ship lost power. The bridge of the Sovereign Wrath plunged into darkness. Consoles flickered, emergency lights casting eerie shadows against the walls. Ralvader spun toward his crew, mandibles clicking furiously. "What happened?" An officer frantically tapped at a dead console. "Sir, our systems have been hijacked. Internal overrides are unresponsive." A new voice crackled through the command deck, a transmission broadcasted across every Dominion vessel. "Hello there." The voice was human, laced with humor and unmistakable confidence. "Welcome to the first intergalactic cyberwar. You lose." Ralvader's mandibles clenched. "Who is this?" "Oh, I'm nobody special," the voice continued. "Just a guy who spent a little too much time hacking Imperial banking systems for fun. Turns out, your military software isn't much better." Laughter rippled through the Dominion fleet, human laughter. The realization settled like a stone in Ralvader's chest. The humans had disabled an entire fleet without firing a single shot. "Systems are rebooting," an officer reported hurriedly. "Too late," Ralvader growled. Explosions erupted as human strike teams, already aboard Dominion vessels, sabotaged key systems from within. The Imperial fleet, so assured of its dominance, had never expected the battle to begin before their weapons were even primed. On the Indomitable, Miller watched as the battlefield dissolved into chaos. Dominion ships floundered, helpless against an enemy that had infiltrated them before the battle had even begun. Colonel Reyes let out a low whistle. "I can't believe that actually worked." Miller gave a half smile. "You still underestimate our people." Reyes shook her head. "No, I just keep forgetting how much fun it is to fight dirty." By the time Dominion forces regained control of their ships, it was too late. Their fleet had been dismantled from the inside, their warships commandeered or left drifting powerless in the void. Those that managed to escape did so with tales of terror, stories of an enemy that could disable entire fleets with a keystroke, infiltrate ships undetected, and dismantle empires not with brute force, but with ingenuity. Ralph Vader stared at the damage reports in silence, his body rigid with cold realization. The Empire had made its worst mistake. They had underestimated humanity, and now there was no stopping them. The Galactic Dominion had suffered military defeats before, but it had always recovered. War was a familiar language among the stars, and the Empire had mastered it over centuries. If an enemy struck, the Dominion retaliated tenfold. If a rebellion arose, it was crushed beneath the weight of overwhelming firepower. Empires did not fall because of skirmishes. They endured. They adapted. They retaliated. But what the Dominion had never faced before, what it could not comprehend, was a war that wasn't fought on battlefields, but in the shadows of its own infrastructure. It started small. A minor fluctuation in the galactic banking system. A single percentage shift in interstellar trade routes. An insignificant delay in hyperspace shipping lanes. Nothing alarming on its own. Nothing that would raise immediate suspicion. But the changes kept coming. On a distant trade hub, an automated system detected an anomaly in the conversion rates between Dominion credits and independent sector currencies. The fluctuation was so minuscule that it went unnoticed by higher officials. But within weeks, the price of essential goods, fuel, food, medical supplies, had begun to rise inexplicably. No single event had caused it, and yet the market felt the shift. At first, the Dominion dismissed the economic tremors as natural instability. Then entire sectors found themselves unable to complete routine transactions. Shipping manifests were scrambled. Supply chains collapsed in real time. And still, the humans did not fire a single shot. Supreme Commander Ralph Vader stood motionless before the holographic financial readout, his four crimson eyes narrowing at the endless strings of fluctuating data. His fleet had recovered from its prior defeat, reinforced by new warships, restructured for efficiency. They were prepared for war. And yet, before they could launch a proper counteroffensive, something far more insidious had begun to strangle the Dominion from within. "They are collapsing our economy," the financial minister announced, his voice strained, mandibles twitching in barely controlled panic. Ralph Vader did not immediately respond. He had spent a lifetime on the battlefield, commanding legions, outmaneuvering enemies, subjugating lesser species beneath the Empire's will. He had prepared for every form of military engagement. But what he was seeing now was not a military maneuver. It was a slow, deliberate act of economic strangulation. "They are disrupting our supply chains," another minister added. "By the time we correct one issue, another appears. They are using our own systems against us." Ralph Vader finally turned his gaze toward them. "Explain." The head of the Dominion Economic Bureau, a frail, elder figure named Velthos, stepped forward. His usual arrogance had faded, replaced by something dangerously close to fear. "The humans have exploited weaknesses in our trade systems. They have infiltrated financial networks, manipulated shipping routes, and, somehow, hacked into our central banking algorithms." "Impossible," Ralph Vader growled. Velthos' mandibles clicked in frustration. "If it were impossible, we wouldn't be having this conversation, Supreme Commander." There was a long silence in the war chamber. Ralph Vader had once believed the humans reckless, undisciplined, lacking in strategic foresight. But this was not the work of a chaotic, disorganized species. This was calculated, intentional, and it was working. On Earth, deep beneath the surface of a decommissioned nuclear facility, a group of human strategists and economists pored over the latest results of their campaign. The room was dimly lit, the hum of old ventilation systems filling the silence between discussions. General Tom Miller stood at the center, arms crossed, as he listened to the reports. Across from him, Lucas Vance, a former financial hacker turned wartime economic saboteur, grinned as he gestured toward the massive screen displaying the current state of Dominion markets. "They're bleeding," Vance announced. "The credit value has dropped another 6% in the last cycle. Trade agreements are falling apart. Their military budget is eating itself alive." Colonel Juno Reyes leaned against the table, her expression skeptical. "I still don't understand how you pulled this off." Vance smirked. "You ever hear of an old Earth scam called short selling?" Miller exhaled sharply. "Explain it." "All right, so let's say you convince someone to loan you something valuable, like a starship. You don't actually own it. You're just borrowing it. Now, before you give it back, you bet that its value is going to drop. You sell it to someone else at its current high price, wait for the value to crash, then buy it back for cheap. You return the item, pocketing the difference." Reyes frowned. "And you did this with an entire galactic economy?" Vance grinned. "Yep." Silence. Then Miller chuckled. It was low, dark, approving. "You weaponized a financial scam." Vance spread his arms. "Not just a scam. A beautifully executed, mathematically flawless act of economic devastation. We hit their supply chains first, mild disruptions, nothing major. Then we manipulated market confidence, leaked a few fake reports, disrupted communication networks, fabricated economic forecasts. The Dominion traders panicked. They started selling off assets, scrambling to salvage losses, and he made a dramatic explosion gesture with his hands. Boom. Reyes shook her head. "You're telling me we didn't even need warships?" "Oh, don't get me wrong. The warships are fun," Vance said. "But this?" He tapped the screen. "This is what real destruction looks like." Miller turned his gaze back to the map. The Dominion had built its empire on the assumption that military strength alone was enough to ensure stability. They had never imagined an enemy that could attack them without ever setting foot on a battlefield. They weren't just fighting the Dominion's armies. They were dismantling its ability to exist. In the High Council chamber of the Dominion Senate, chaos reigned. Ambassador Valzeth stood at the center of the room, his composure cracking beneath the weight of the crisis. Around him, Dominion officials shouted over one another, voices raised in panic. The economic collapse was no longer a theoretical problem. It was a reality. Trade routes had crumbled. Entire planetary economies had gone bankrupt overnight, and the value of Dominion currency had plummeted to its lowest recorded level. "This is a coordinated attack," one senator bellowed. Valzeth clenched his jaw. "No fleet could have done this," he admitted. "This is something else." The Emperor himself had not spoken yet, but his silence carried more weight than the shouting of the others. He sat upon his throne, fingers steepled in contemplation, his reptilian eyes cold and calculating. He had ruled for centuries. He had seen rebellions come and go. But this was the slow death of an empire. Finally he spoke. "We must end this war before we lose everything." The words sent a ripple through the chamber. The very idea of surrender was unthinkable. The Dominion had never conceded defeat in its long history. But the truth was undeniable. The humans had not fought the war the way the Dominion expected. They had fought it on their own terms, in their own way, and they had turned the very foundations of the empire into a weapon against itself. There was no winning this. Valzeth swallowed hard, his throat dry. "What are your orders, my Emperor?" The Emperor exhaled slowly. "We must negotiate." The room fell silent. The words were blasphemy, but there was no alternative. The Dominion was on its knees. And the humans? They were just getting started. The Imperial Palace on Gizmo Prime stood as a testament to the Dominion's reign, its towering spires stretching into the crimson-tinged sky, its foundations laid over centuries of conquest. Tonight, however, those halls echoed with the silence of a dying empire. The great banners that once draped the throne room with declarations of supremacy now hung limp, their grandeur dimmed by the reality unfolding beyond the walls. Emperor Zeldar sat upon his throne, his reptilian fingers drumming against the carved armrest. He had spent lifetimes bending entire civilizations to his will, his name spoken in hushed reverence across the stars. And yet, in this moment, he faced something the Dominion had never known: fear. It was not the kind of fear born from the threat of invasion or rebellion. It was something deeper, existential, the slow realization that the weight of 1,000 years of rule meant nothing when the very structure holding it together had been hollowed out from within. Before him, Supreme Commander Ral Vader knelt, his obsidian exoskeleton gleaming under the dim light. He was not a man prone to failure, nor was he accustomed to defeat, but the weight on his shoulders was inescapable. "The humans have given us a deadline," Ral Vader said, his voice steady despite the humiliation clawing at his insides. Zeldar's eyes flickered. "And if we refuse?" The commander hesitated, not out of uncertainty, but because the words felt unreal. "Then, by the time the next sun rises, the Dominion will cease to exist." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Zeldar's jaw tightened. "How?" Ral Vader rose slowly, his crimson eyes dark with something unspoken. "They control our fleets. Our financial systems are collapsing. Our own people riot in the streets, demanding an end to this war. If we continue, we will have nothing left to rule." Zeldar's claws pressed into the armrest of his throne. He had underestimated these creatures from the beginning. He had thought them weak, predictable. No species that had clawed its way from a single planet to the stars without assistance should have been a threat to a dominion that spanned hundreds of worlds. And yet, the humans had done something far worse than fight them. They had played with them. This war had never been about battlefield victories. It had been about unraveling the Dominion from the inside, like a parasite eating away at its host. And now, at the end of it all, the Emperor understood. The humans had not wanted conquest. They had not sought territory or even vengeance. They had simply wanted to win. And they had. A soft chime echoed through the chamber. A transmission request. Ral Vader moved without waiting for the Emperor's command, pressing the control that allowed the image to materialize in front of them. A human stood on the other side of the transmission. General Tom Miller looked unimpressed, his grizzled face showing the wear of war, but none of its desperation. He was seated, relaxed, a half-drunk cup of coffee in one hand. The contrast was staggering. On one side, the weight of an empire teetering on the brink, and on the other, a man who looked as though he had already written the end of this story. "Well," Miller said, taking a sip, "this is awkward." Zeldar's nostrils flared. "You dare address me this way?" Miller set his coffee down and leaned forward. "Let's not pretend you have the upper hand, Your Majesty. We both know how this ends." The Emperor's claws flexed. "You demand surrender." Miller tilted his head, as if considering. "Not surrender. Let's call it a restructuring of power." Zeldar's eyes darkened. "And if I refuse?" Miller smirked, but there was no joy in it, only inevitability. "Then we finish what we started." He gestured lazily with one hand. "See, the thing about humans is we don't quit. You can wipe out a battalion, a city, even a planet, and we'll still come back. Because we don't fight wars the way you do. We don't need to outnumber you. We just need to be smarter than you. And, well, we both know how that's been going." Zeldar's grip tightened on the throne. Miller continued, his tone casual. "Right now, my people control enough of your economy that your empire is basically running on fumes. We have access to your military data, your fleet movements, your defense grids. We've let you keep just enough power so you think you have options. But here's the truth, Your Majesty. If you don't agree to our terms, by this time tomorrow, you won't even have a throne to sit on." Ral Vader had seen many wars. He had studied the art of battle, had led forces across dozens of systems, had watched species break beneath the Dominion's might. And yet, he had never seen anything like this. Miller took another sip of coffee. So what's it going to be? Silence. Then, slowly, painfully, the Emperor exhaled. Ralph Vader turned his head slightly. What are your terms? Miller set the coffee cup aside and leaned forward. 1. You publicly acknowledge the Dominion's crimes against humanity. Zeldar's claws dug into the throne, but he remained silent. 2. Miller continued, reparations. Economic, technological, whatever we decide. And no, you don't get to negotiate the amount. The Emperor's jaw tightened. And 3. Miller's smirk returned, just barely. You don't mess with us again. Ever. A long silence stretched between them. Zeldar knew, in his heart, that there was no alternative. The humans had already won. He inhaled sharply and closed his eyes for a brief moment before reopening them. Agreed. Miller's smirk widened slightly. Good choice. The transmission ended. Ralph Vader turned toward his Emperor, awaiting an order, an outburst, a refusal, anything. Instead, the Emperor simply sat there unmoving, his entire being drained of the weight he had carried for centuries. He was no longer the ruler of the Dominion. Not truly. He was a man who had been bested. Ralph Vader spoke carefully. What now? Zeldar let out a slow breath. Now. He exhaled bitterly. Now we survive. Across the galaxy, the news spread like wildfire. The Dominion had fallen, not to war, not to superior firepower, but to the relentless, chaotic ingenuity of humanity. The story of the 10 executed women, the spark that had ignited the fire, became legend. And as humanity took its place among the stars, the lesson was clear. They were not conquerors. They were not tyrants. But they were a species that would never, ever be underestimated again.